Chapter 10: Racial and Ethnic Inequality. We are going to discuss minority, racial, and ethnic groups, prejudice and discrimination, sociological perspectives on race and ethnicity, spectrum of intergroup relations, race and ethnicity in the United States, immigration and continuing diversity, and social policy and racial and ethnic inequality, global refugee crisis. Minority, racial, and ethnic groups. So a racial group is basically looking at people's physical differences that they have. Race is a social construct, so it's something that we use socially, but it's not real when it comes to science, nor when it comes to genetics. Also, an ethnic group is basically what sets people apart depending on where they're from, so like their national origin or distinctive cultural patterns. As of 2014, these are the racial groups in the United States. And we have the census coming up for 2020, so make sure you fill that out. It is important that we have the correct information as far as demographics on the census. So these are the ethnic groups in the US as of 2014. So it's based on data from a 5-year interval from 2009 to 2013. Minority groups. So people of minority groups have less power over their own lives, and that's due to policy and the structure of U.S. society. So properties of minorities include unequal treatment, cultural characteristics that can be distinguished, involuntary membership, solidarity, and in-group marriage. So race, as I mentioned before, is a social construct, so it's not really real when it comes to differentiating between different groups of people. People originated out of Africa and migrated, so there are not a whole lot of genetic differences between humans in general. So it should be the human race, but since it's a social construct, we look at people by their physical appearances, and that's what the U.S. is built on. So social construction of race, as I said, it's something that was created for society as far as a hierarchy goes in the US. And then there's racial formation. So the way race is construed is it changes over time. So race is sort of fluid if you look at the history of the US after colonialism. So when the first whites were moved here, or when they came here, they migrated here, all whites weren't included in the white group. So there were the Protestant whites, and then there were the Italians, people that were Jews, people that weren't Irish, people that weren't included in the label that was white. So the people that were Jews and Irish and Italians and Polish people and other subgroups, they basically were treated as less than. They had to be servants and work hard labor, work hard hours, and they had the difficult labels that other groups are given as far as being lazy and as far as it being their fault that they were poor. And then later on that changed over time, so those groups were included within the white label. But this label is continuing to change. And as far as race goes, when there is enough people of a certain group, then they're included, like on the census. So for the 2020 census, we should see some new groups pop up, but all groups aren't given access to being labeled on there unless there's enough of them in the US. So race includes multiple identities. So Du Bois predicted the color line foremost problem of the 20th century, and basically that's trying to decide where the color line begins and ends, especially when there's a lot of mixing of various races as far as the hue and the skin tone that people have. So that is going to continuously change globally. And then there's immigration from Latin America, so it shows a fluid nature of race formation, because if you look at people from Latin America, from the various countries, They all come in different shades, different hair types, different eye color, different characteristics as far as culture, different ways of speaking Spanish or other dialects from Latin America. So it's not just something that's black or white. And in the 2010 census, there was over 9 million people who reported that they were 2 or more races. And I'm from California, so there's some forms where people put that they're 3 or more races or 4 or more races. Ethnicity has more to do with where people are from, so their national origin or distinctive cultural patterns of how they do things. Maybe the foods that they use, the music they listen to, the language that they speak, their religion. So all of that can be comprised of an ethnicity. And there's the distinction between racial and ethnic groups, but it's not always clear. So there are some people that are like ethnically ambiguous, is what I call it. And basically by looking at them, you can't tell who they are, any type of racial mixture that's inside of them. You might have some idea, but you can't really tell. And then the distinction between racial and ethnic groups are socially significant as far as the U.S. goes, since there is a racial hierarchy as far as stratification, but you can't always tell by looking at people, or some people are able to go between groups, especially if they're ethnically ambiguous. So figure 10-1 basically shows the projection of how the races will be divided in the U.S. So when it comes to sociology, just remember some of these things are theory, so they're not really fact in some ways, and some of it is opinions also. And some in itself could be fact, but this is just a projection, so it's a theory. It's not going to be completely correct. And then when it comes to African American, I think there's some difficulty when it comes to that because all groups are included in African American. So people from Africa will be African American, people that are black, but what about darker hued or toned Hispanics? Would they also be included in black? People from different islands, would they be included in black? And then the U.S. has a history of the 1-drop rule, which stated that if you had a drop of African blood in you, that you were considered black. That's not so much now, but that sort of brings into question the percentage of what's labeled African American. So I know some charts will say 12% or 13%. I actually believe the number is much higher, but it's not really lumped into all one group. And then, of course, to be black in the U.S., there's a native black people, and then there are the black people that are a mixture of various races. Prejudice and discrimination. So historically, the U.S. was founded and based on prejudice and discrimination of a group leaving Europe because they were being discriminated against, and then coming to the U.S. and discriminating against people that were here, and then other people that were brought here or migrated here. So there's a lot of, negative history as far as the U.S., but the future can be positive. We just have to work together to make it that way. So there's less overt discrimination and prejudice, and that means if someone were to walk up to somebody and just start yelling racial slurs, things like that, there's less of that, and there's less laws as far as redlining, so not letting people that are from minority groups live in certain areas, especially blacks. And housing associations did that, banks did that. It wasn't just people in the neighborhood that did things like that. It was actually systematically put that way. So since there's less of that going on, it doesn't mean that it's not continuously happening. It's just less overt. So then we call it covert, where those happen to be the microaggressions that you might experience, as far as somebody coming up and, petting somebody's hair just because it's different, or assuming that they eat animals depending on which country that they're from, and maybe they don't eat certain types of animals. So all of those things are forms of prejudice and discrimination. So college campuses have had more incidents. There's, newspapers and radio stations that have issues. There are white supremacist organizations which are on the rise. And then there are clashes between white and black students. There is a lot of division with the current political climate, but it is not something that started with the current president. I know you might hear people say that, but it's not that. This is something that has been embedded in the U.S., and it's coming up now, but it doesn't mean it's going to continue. I just don't want it to be where people blame one person for this situation when this is a societal issue. Prejudice. So it's having a negative attitude toward an entire category of people. So ethnocentrism is where a person believes that their group is correct, their ethnicity, their race, the way they live, the way they talk, the food they eat, things like that is all correct, and everyone else should change and be more like them. Racism is having power over someone else and treating other people as inferior. So minorities can be prejudiced. They can carry stereotypes about other groups of people, but they cannot be racist if they don't have power. So I think that is a big thing to keep in mind. And then there are a lot of hate crimes. Those are on the rise. And then we have stereotypes, and those are generalizations that are unreliable about members of different groups. And stereotypes are actually really fed through the media. So if somebody hasn't ever encountered a type of person or a group of people, well, if they see the stereotype that's negative on TV and that's all that's ever told, that same story over and over and over, it sort of feeds that prejudiceness, and the person starts to have those ideals. Children pick up on those things that we adults do as far as being prejudiced against other people, or even, things. It could be weather that you're prejudiced against. You might be prejudiced against a dog. Like maybe you don't like animals, but kids pick up on all that. So if we act different toward a person of a different race, then that child is going to have those preconceived notions in their mind. They might not fully understand it, but they know that something is off about that person. Colorblind racism. So it's race neutrality to defend racially unequal status quo. So the hierarchy system we have here. So it's covert racism. It's not something that's overt. It's not something that is obvious to everyone. But basically people will say, well, I don't see color. So that can become an issue, because that means that the person that doesn't see color doesn't realize the real world experiences that this other person has faced because of the tone or color of their skin. I just think it's best for people to listen to one another and to think that, okay, this person, this is their experience. Like, you might not believe that everybody has experienced it, but maybe just this one person has experienced it, or enough people have experienced it that, it is an issue. The color line still is in place, but it gets moved around a lot. Like I said, different races are included into the white group. As far as whitening goes. So when it comes to whitening, it's not like it's just based off of skin tone at that point, because it also includes a class system. So people that are well off and wealthy, they're included in the whitened system, if that makes sense. So they're the people that own the businesses, that have lots of money. A lot of these celebrities, people that have access to things that regular people do not. So the color line keeps changing. In the U.S., I am curious to see how it's going to change in the future, but it's changed continuously throughout our past, that we know it's going to continue to morph, especially with the mixtures and how the kids are nowadays. There are a lot of kids that are from different cultures, different races, different ethnicities. Discriminatory behavior. So it's the denial of opportunities and equal rights to people on an arbitrary basis. So that could be like how some people are blocked from voting, or some natives aren't able to vote because they live on reservations. So things like that are forms of discrimination. So there's attitudes, that's not the same as behavior. So a person might not like people of a certain race, so they might discriminate against them internally, but that is definitely not the same as discriminating against somebody as far as behavior and blocking them from opportunities. People do have a right to like or not like whoever they don't. So discrimination persists even for most educated and qualified minority group members. So it doesn't matter how high they go on the totem pole, the social hierarchy, they'll still be discriminated against for various reasons. Usually race has to do with it. And then there is a glass ceiling. So that's an invisible barrier blocking people from certain environments, certain incomes. Women also face the glass ceiling they can move up or get paid. So here is the income in the U.S. by race, ethnicity, and gender. So, white privilege. So, it's rights or immunities granted to people as a benefit or favor simply because they are white. So, one of the examples in the book is redlining and in life in general. So, banks and companies basically made maps of everywhere. You can still see it actually in Louisville because Louisville is extremely segregated by race, but you can see it actually all over the U.S., not just here. But basically, banks and companies would make, with the government, they would make patterns, and they would say the A area, and that would be for whites. And then basically the D areas would be places that they don't want people to bring businesses to. They want factories to be there, and that would be for blacks. And that was around the Jim Crow era of keeping things separated and segregated. But redlining still persists. So if you live in Louisville and you know about it, there's a 9th Street divide, and a lot of those people make less than $9,000 a year, and they're mostly black. So redlining is still an issue. Hopefully that will change. The sad thing is that when some of these ghettos are torn down, the people have nowhere to go. They might end up in other areas, and then there will be white flight where people will move, usually whites. They will move to more rural areas or areas that are safer, and then some people just move from areas that have minorities in it, because when it came to redlining back in the day, places that had minorities, the cost of the homes would decrease. So then some whites wouldn't want to be in that area because they just invested in a home. Also, when it came to redlining, a lot of blacks were put into contracts where they had to pay more to be in a contract with a house for a house, but they were never able to own it. And we know that wealth is generated by passing down homes over time, so intergenerational wealth. So redlining is a huge issue. And as far as white privilege goes, so I think a good way of explaining it is that some people are born white and they're not doing anything to exert this privilege. They're just born this way into how the system is, as far as whites being the dominant group. So when someone says that someone has white privilege, they're not necessarily saying that the person is bad. It's just that it's what someone is afforded. Some way I also explain this is when it comes to being skinny. So as far as American society, as far as Hollywood goes, they want people to be more on the thinner side. So some people are just born with the genes where they're able to eat whatever they want, and they have the privilege of that, and they just still stay thin and trim as far as what societal standards might be. So it's sort of like that, but of course there's more heaviness to it when it comes to white privilege. There are various ways of using it. So as far as being an ally, a person that could use their white privilege to speak up if they see some minority that is being abused in an area, or maybe speak up for them on the job, speak up for them if you see them out, or if you see any acts of police brutality that you can definitely tell is police brutality and just not someone, having an encounter with a police officer. That would be a good time to step in and, maybe say the situation might be wrong. So if you see somebody being abused in some kind of way, it could be white privilege could be used to correct those issues. So there's institutional discrimination. You might have heard people say the man, basically that there's a man in government keeping groups of people, oppressed or down. So that's just talking about institutional discrimination. So it's a denial of opportunities and equal rights to individuals and groups that results from normal operations of a society. And affirmative action was positive efforts to recruit minority members or women for jobs, promotions, and educational opportunities, because a lot of the times, a lot of these companies used to be just white males. Some companies still are, but affirmative action was to give other people also a seat at the table. People that were qualified, not just anybody. So these are Nash's three functions that racially prejudiced beliefs serve for the dominant group. So it would be a moral justification for maintaining an unequal society, as if this is how things should be, or maybe people deserve it to be this way. It discourages subordinate groups, so minority groups, from questioning their status, and people just think it is the way it is. And suggesting that any major social change would bring greater poverty to the minority. So if you think of that, that would be like increasing wages. And then some people say, well, that's going to cause inflation and everything to go up. Well, if people were to look around, they would see that things are continuously going up anyways. And a good way of determining that is like, hey, what was the price of gas when you were a kid? So what is it now? So that in itself is inflation. However, the income of regular people is not increasing, but people are working harder and working more. So from a functionalist perspective, Rose has four dysfunctions associated with racism. So society doesn't use all of its resources as far as people goes when it comes to discrimination. It aggravates social problems and causes issues between people. Society must invest time and money to defend barriers to full participation. As far as redlining goals, they had to have laws to make those things okay, as far as those contracts that should have been illegal, instead of using resources to better society. And racial prejudice undercuts goodwill and diplomatic relations between nations. So a conflict perspective as far as exploitation theory goes, it says racism keeps minorities in low-paying jobs and supplies dominant group with cheap labor. And also you could apply that to how the U.S. basically ships jobs overseas and it supplies into the U.S. economy. But of course, that doesn't explain all prejudice. That's just the exploitation theory of it. The labeling perspective talks about racial profiling. So it's any arbitrary action initiated by an authority based on race, ethnicity, or national origin, rather than on a person's behavior. So these are based on stereotypes that are explicit. So something that someone might have seen on TV, or maybe someone had a negative encounter with a certain group of people and apply that to all of them. So it's misleading. There's a lot of profiling that happens. An example is Arab Americans at airports. They're more likely to be searched, and sometimes they're denied being on a plane. There's been some cases or situations that you probably have heard about in the media, but there's more than just what is put out there. And the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in the wake of deaths of African Americans at the hands of police officers. So Black Lives Matter was about stopping police brutality. It wasn't about other groups of people not being important, and it wasn't about women also not being important, dying at the hands of police, and not, of course, for those situations where somebody is attacking a police officer and the police officer is defending themselves. It was just about the brutality that Black people experience overwhelmingly in the U.S. Interactionist perspective believes that in the contact hypothesis, so when people have contact with people that are different than them, then it will lead to less prejudice and people will abandon their old stereotypes. So I believe if you know somebody's story, it's near impossible to actually hate them if you know their story. So more people need to talk to one another, have open conversations about a lot of this conflict that's happening in society, and hopefully we can overcome these things. Spectrum of intergroup relations. So racial and ethnic groups can relate to one another in a variety of ways, and there's genocide, where it's just the deliberate, systematic killing of an entire people or nation. So there are Jews, there are Africans, there are natives, there are Armenians. There are a lot of people that have experienced a type of genocide. It's really sad. Expulsion of a people is another extreme means of acting out racial ethnic prejudice, so you're kind of kicking them out. And then secession is failure to resolve ethnic or racial conflict, results in drawing formal boundaries between the groups. Segregation, so it's the physical separation of two groups of people in terms of residence, in terms of where they live. So we had Jim Crow here, and South Africa had their form of segregation segregation, which was apartheid. Amalgamation, so it happens when a majority group and a minority group combine to form a new group, and that is like how people say the U.S. is a melting pot or a tossed salad. Assimilation is adapting to the new cultural traditions and leaving the old ones behind. So assimilation progressed further in the U.S. than in Europe, although more slowly than in Canada. Pluralism is based on mutual respect between different groups of people. It says Switzerland has more of this, more so than the U.S. So as far as the U.S. goes, it's determined by immigration. There's a lot of that happens every day. Colonialism, it still has a legacy here, and it is still actually being enacted. And then slavery. So there's chattel slavery, and that's what was done to blacks and Africans. And then there is slavery, like indentured servitude, and that's what happened with the Irish, Italians, various groups of Asians, various groups of whites from Europe, various groups of different types of blacks. So a lot of people have gone through various types of slavery. And now we have the sex slave trade that is continuously happening. And people work in sweatshops, sometimes they're in nail salons, and they're also being enslaved. So African Americans, 1 out of every 4 African American is poor. Contemporary just means present day. So institutional discrimination that's currently happening at the individual level as far as prejudice goes is rooted in the history of slavery and colonialism. The civil rights movement gave blacks more rights, but it did not continue as far as the rights go. More progress should have been made since the 1960s, but a lot of progress has been made since then, but we just need more. So the Black Power movement of the 80s, so it was rejecting into being assimilated into white middle class society, but Black Power was also about loving black skin, believing that you could love your hair the way it grows out of your head, believing that you are smart too, that you're capable of being part of American society, that you're able to fully be American and no longer a 3/5 a person. So it was a lot of that as far as education and things like that. Then blacks suffer in terms of their life chances. So life chances is basically how long you're going to live, your social mobility, how you're going to move up in society, health outcomes, and that is because of stress from everyday racism, discriminatory practices, and how a lot of blacks are put into jails for the same crimes that other people commit who aren't put in jail at all. So it's just another form of keeping slavery going. And then blacks remain significantly underrepresented in different, fields, careers, avenues. It's like that purposefully. That's just the way the system is set up. However, I do think people can do what they can to increase their life chances. Don't contribute to the negativity when it comes to issues within their own groups. So Native Americans represent diverse array of cultures. There's over 500 tribes that's within the U.S. in itself. There's an increasing number of people claiming Native identity, except it could be difficult because they have to prove their blood quantum, and that depends on what each tribe has with the treaty, with the government as far as what's being recognized. So some people believe that natives have access to casinos. Certain native populations do, but most of them do not. So the federal government in 2009 settled a 13-year-old lawsuit for recovery of lease payments due on tribal lands. The government has reneged on every treaty, though, with natives, and the introduction of gambling on Indian reservations transformed the lives of some, but it's very, very few of them. And of course, natives, just like any other group, have their own issues when it comes to alcoholism and depression. Asian Americans, they're one of the fastest growing populations in the U.S. It's very diverse. So you can think of Chinese, Japanese. You think of people that are Laotian, Hmong. It just depends where you are in the U.S. if you will see people from different parts of the world. So, ironically, often held up as the unqualified success story. So basically, they're saying that if someone is of Asian descent, from the Middle East or different places, also included in the Asian group, that they're just automatically going to be successful. However, there are some groups of people that are enslaved from some of these countries, and they don't actually end up with the success story that people usually place on Asians as far as the model minority. A lot of Asians will reject that because they're looked at as maybe safe, demure, just somebody that's not really going to speak up and ruffle any feathers as far as making change. But a lot of Asian immigrants are found in low-paying service occupations, while the better educated Asians are in professional and managerial positions. And so when it comes to their income, the Asians that are able to migrate here now are able to come because of the jobs and the education, whereas other groups of people might be fleeing to come to America because they want the same access. And then Asians, as far as some of their issues, is they have higher rates of cancer than some other groups, tuberculosis, and then higher rates of suicides. So Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders broken down on this figure 10-5. So one group that had issues as far as the U.S. goes are the Chinese. So they were encouraged to immigrate between 1850 to 1880. However, in 1882, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act. People were put into concentration camps. They were kicked out of the U.S. They were denied migration rights. But there's currently over 3 million Chinese Americans in the U.S. And then we have Asian Indians. So they're the second largest Asian group. They're a diverse population. Filipino Americans. So they're classified as Asian, but also reflect centuries of Spanish and U.S. colonial rule as far as religion and some other customs. And then a lot of them already speak English, not just Tagalog. So that's from the colonialism. So a significant percentage are well-educated professionals who work in healthcare, and there's strong loyalty to family and the Catholic Church. So Vietnamese Americans came during and after the Vietnam War, and then we also have Korean Americans here. So they came between 1903 and 1910, and then they came after the Korean War. Then there was a third wave that started with the Immigration Act of 1965. And so there's friction between Korean Americans and African Americans that started in the 1990s since they moved to urban areas and opened establishments to serve the Black community. However, they sometimes would have conflict with treating the Black community bad. So there's been conflicts between these two groups that still continue on to this day. Japanese Americans. So by 1943, there was over 100,000 Japanese Americans forced into camps in response to World War II. In 1988, the U.S. gave $1.25 billion to pay for reparations as far as how the Japanese were treated in the concentration camps. Arab Americans, so about 4 million of them are in the U.S. Immigrants and descendants from 22 different nations of the Arab world. So they cannot be characterized as far as like having a specific family pattern or even just looking at them. Some people can't tell. They can tell maybe they're from the Middle East, but they don't know exactly which country or which ancestry that they are comprised of. And so there's a lot of racial profiling of Arabs and Muslims as far as being terrorists because of a lot of the issues that happened with 9/11 and then the continuing wars that the U.S. is fighting in the Middle East. So some people that are Muslim or Arabs have experienced discrimination. So these are the religious affiliations as far as Arab Americans go. So Latinos are the largest minority group in the U.S. At the time, they had 55 million, but now there are more. So they share the Spanish language and some of the heritage and culture. However, there are differences in the dialects of Spanish depending on where a person is from. Some people have an issue assimilating and others don't. So if you live in places like El Paso, Texas, there are a lot of Mexicans there, so they assimilate less than somebody who is of Latino descent and moves to somewhere in Kentucky. Oh, and as far as health issues for Latinos, it could be heart disease, diabetes. So the Hispanic population by origin as of 2014, you can see the different places that they migrate to the U.S. from. Mexican Americans accounted for 42% of the nation's population growth between 2000 and 2010. And Mexicans are currently having the biggest number of children, or the largest number of children within their families compared to other races in the U.S. So they're descendants of people from the Mexican-American War, and then some people migrated here to the U.S. through the Bracero program, and that's where the U.S. wanted Latinos to work in agriculture as far as having cheaper labor. And then after that program ended, the U.S. was kind of like, you either stay here or you leave. Of course, before then there was the Mexican-American War, and some of these states were actually part of Mexico, and that would be California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, all of those. And then since at least the year 2000, Mexican Americans born in the U.S. far exceeded those who immigrated here. Puerto Rican, so they hold U.S. citizenship. However, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, so the U.S. owns Puerto Rico. So many will migrate to the eastern part of the U.S., especially in New York. They have experienced lots of poverty in Puerto Rico and in the U.S. They haven't been as successful as Mexicans in organizing for their rights. There's also a smaller percentage of them. And their central political issue is in its present Commonwealth status and the possibility of petitioning for statehood or attempting independence. So they've attempted to petition for statehood. The U.S. hasn't accepted it yet, but it would be interesting to see if one day the U.S. will accept Puerto Rico as one of our states. Cuban American. So they migrated here in earnest. So the U.S. also wanted them to come during Castro's rise and during his power. So there's a Cuban Revolution. So the first wave included many professionals. Recent waves include people that are less likely to be skilled professionals. So there's been improved relations between the U.S. and Cuba, but we will see as far as travel restrictions, because they were eased, but now the travel restrictions have increased again. So I guess we'll just continue to see the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. Central and South America, so it's about 7 million people, and the population is completely diverse. So there's people from Guyana that speak French, there's people from Brazil that speak Portuguese, and there's people from Suriname that speak Dutch. So they speak all different types of languages. So they have a complex system that recognizes a multitude of color gradients, and they have a racial hierarchical system there also, where the darker races are placed near the bottom. And they also have a class system. So they have a caste system as far as like the hue and skin tone. Then they have a class system as far as wealth and social status, which is like your social capital. So how much clout do you have, how popular somebody is. There's religious differences, and then different upbringings and dialects. Jewish Americans are about 2% of the U.S. population. A lot of Jewish people have faced discrimination and prejudice, and of course, different types of abuse. So there's anti-Semitism, and those are people that are against Jewish people, that are prejudiced against them, and they have difficulty maintaining religious and cultural heritage. So American Jews almost as likely to marry a Gentile, so that would be someone that's a non-Jew as a Jew. White ethnics, so whites came here about 150 years ago. So there's 49 million that are German, there's 36 million that are Irish, 17 million that are Italian, and 10 million that are Polish. So of course the groups vary in differences. So they have symbolic ethnicity, so emphasis on concerns such as ethnic food or political issues rather than deeper ties to one's own ethnic heritage. And that's because in the US, when people come from Europe and their skin tone is lighter, they're moved into the white group, and sometimes people have lost their ancestry. So people weren't always taught like the Italian language, to speak Italian or to speak any of these other languages, because at first the U.S. wouldn't accept them. So they wanted their kids to, to move up in society, get better jobs, to stop being treated as less than and stop being discriminated against. So they wanted their kids to assimilate as much as possible. And since their kids had the lighter skin tone, they basically had to behave the way that Americans wanted people to behave, who were more Protestant Anglo-Saxons. So that's where some of that ethnicity as far as ancestry goes, with it being lost. And whites, as far as some of the health issues, it would be cancer, heart disease, diabetes. So immigration and continuing diversity. So the U.S. has wanted people to migrate here, and then there are times where the U.S. doesn't want people to migrate here. So the U.S. typically wants people to migrate here when we need people for different jobs. We need different skills. We need people to work the jobs that other people don't want to work. However, of course, with immigration, there's a lot of debate and issues that's currently happening right now. So there's fear and resentment as far as the diversity factor goes. There's fear of the Hispanic population continuing to grow, since they are growing the quickest out of all the races, and they're also migrating here quicker. And then illegal immigration is an issue, despite the Reform and Control Act of 1968 as far as immigration goes. So people are crossing the border continuously all the time from various places. And the system is not, there isn't enough resources, I want to say, when it comes to dealing with border issues. There are a lot of issues. I like to ask my students when we have class, what does it take for someone to become an American? Like, what makes somebody an American? And I think once we have an idea of that, then we could have maybe a path to citizenship. So depending on where people are migrating from, they might have more access to becoming a citizen sooner than people from other countries. It kind of just depends on the U.S.'s relationship with that the host country or the person is leaving from. So immigration is both functional and dysfunctional. It helps with labor shortages, but it causes stress on social services as far as, you know, welfare. If people qualify for benefits, all immigrants don't, some do. As far as taxes go, that causes an issue as far as people that live in the country half of the year versus going back home to their home country, their country of origin. So that way they don't pay as many taxes. It just, you know, depends on the group, depends on the relationship with the U.S. and that host country. Figure 10-8 shows legal migration to the United States between 1820 and 2010. So all the ones that are in green are from European countries, and then all the other ones are from all the other countries. So looking at social policy and racial and ethnic inequality as far as the refugee crisis goes. So refugees are people granted right to enter a country while still residing abroad. The U.S. resettles 56,000 to 73,000 annually. That number, I believe, has decreased recently. So I'm not sure what the new number is going to be, and it also depends on which country the people are from. There's also asylum seekers, and those are people that were born in a different country who have already entered the country and seek protection from persecution. So people can come here legally seeking asylum without going through the paperwork process. However, once they get here, they have to let, you know, U.S. officials know why they're here, what they're fleeing from, and the U.S. can investigate if they believe it's an asylum case or not. And as far as refugees and asylum seekers, they are set up in a place to live and given access to foods and, you know, welfare, things like that. Of course, just to help them get on their feet. Other countries do this for other people that come over. Some people see an issue with how much help as far as social services go to other groups of people, since the U.S. does have a lot of issues. And then some people are for it as far as humanity goes and compassion. So it just depends on what people's own experiences are as far as how the social policies have personally affected their lives. So there's conflicts in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East that have increased the people that are coming here. So people might be coming from Sudan, Darfur. There's just a lot of places where people are being persecuted. And the U.S., people view it as the home of the free. So some people want to escape that. And people feel like the U.S. has a lot of protections that they might not be receiving in their host country or their home country. When it comes to refugees, they can give an economic boost. So people that have migrated here and refugees, when they're being taxed, they're paying into the Social Security system as far as people with citizenship have. So it might be something that they never actually benefit from if they don't become a citizen. But then conflict theorists point out the refugee crisis, and so people might be stigmatized because they are refugee, and some people are against the whole idea of various people coming here from other countries. So the affluent countries are the countries that people are fleeing from, because they're fleeing from, you know, maybe war-torn countries, violence, economic refugees. And now what seems to be happening is that some people are going to have to flee because of climate change and how it might be affecting where they live, as far as crops not growing, things like that. So they might move. Initiating policy, there will be some long-term strategies as far as helping people that are refugees. There are so many all over the world that I'm wondering how various countries are going to help in these situations. When people come to the new country, some people are hostile towards them, and because of the terrorist attacks, people have concerns about people from the Middle East, even if the people that have come aren't terrorists, but they might have seen just that single story told in the media, or they might have only heard about Middle Eastern people from terrorist attacks. If you look at the media, it'll mention somebody from the Middle East or someone who's Muslim, and it will talk about terrorism probably in the same sentence continuously. And so that puts the idea in everyone's minds as far as the U.S. goes, as far as Middle Easterners and terrorism. But some of them are fleeing, you know, terrorism in their own places, and they want to come to the U.S.